Movie Nut here with a review for Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, the 2012 horror action mashup film starring Benjamin Walker, Mary Elizabeth Winstead, and Dominic Cooper. Based on the novel of the same name by the writer of the screenplay, the story, beginning in the early part of the 19th century, follows the life of the 16th President of the USA, Abraham Lincoln, and his secret profession as a vampire hunter, brought on by his mother's murder at the hands of one of them. In his pursuit for revenge, he is trained by Henry Sturgis, himself a vampire and rebel against his kind, and together they uncover a conspiracy that could undermine the United States itself and bring about the death of millions by the hands of ambitious vampires headed up by the mysterious Adam. The cast all around do surprisingly well in their roles, given the material, which I'll get into later when we talk about script. Benjamin Walker does do a pretty good performance portraying Lincoln throughout the various points of his life. In spite of the questionable material, he does give Lincoln a fair bit of sympathy, and we see him struggle with his profession versus his own desires in life. And later, when Walker is in the makeup, you do buy him as the historical Abraham Lincoln, and he handles the speeches very well. And he gives that perfect commanding presence that Lincoln had then. Dominic Cooper also does a good job in the role of Henry Sturgis, who is the de facto mentor of the movie. He is scheming and manipulative, but he does legitimately care for Lincoln. And Cooper does exude a sort of wisdom about him, not to mention he has surprisingly decent chemistry with Walker. Mary Elizabeth Winstead plays Mary Todd, who would become the wife of Lincoln, and does it well, though she doesn't get a tremendous amount to do, but you do feel that she and Lincoln do care deeply about each other, and she's not just a typical damsel in distress, nor is she played up as like a stereotype of the time with the corsets and big skirts and everything. She does have her own attitude, and she does have determination to her. And the cast is rounded out by a couple more familiar names like Anthony Mackie, Martin Cossacks, and Jimmy Simpson, who all do fairly well in their roles, though particular mention goes to Rufus Sewell as Adam, the main villain of the movie. Though he isn't given the best material to work with, he does have menace to him, which is a welcome relief given for how long we've had to deal with unthreatening vampires in movies, and he's a welcome return to that sort of form, while not necessarily overacting or going into scenery chewing mode. More praise has to go towards the visual team here, who did a really good job with the CGI, which makes up a good portion of the movie. Especially considering that this film was made for only about $69 million, which though to the layman might sound a lot, when you think about Hollywood budgets and summer action movies, is pigeon feed. And for that limited amount of money, the CG here looks pretty good. Some would argue it looks a little underdone, though my argument is that it reminds me a lot of paintings from the 1800s. It has that aesthetic to it, it uses those type of colors, and it fits perfectly. Not to mention the period setting gives way to good-looking sets, good-looking costumes, the waistcoats, the top hats. They all look really good and feel period accurate. Plus, I want to give props to the people who did the makeup and CG for the vampires. For the first time in a long time, these feel like proper vampires. None of that Twilight sparkly crap here. These are visceral and animalistic. They have huge, sharp fangs. In fact, all their teeth are fangs. Their skin turns grey. Their eyes are like black, almost obsidian in colour. And you feel that they are savage and will just rip you apart to get at your blood. They have a grey animalistic quality to them. And the action sequences of themselves, for the most part, are handled really well. It mixes up traditional techniques with some slow motion, and though some could get a little annoyed by this, I never felt that they abused the gimmick too much, and they only used it when it really calls for it, like when Lincoln jumps off a wall and spins around and slices off vampires' heads, or when he's dodging around the horses during a chase sequence, or especially on the train where he and his partner fight off vampires using the same axe, which looked really, really cool. And the score by Henry Jackman, though a couple of times used cheaply as jump scare music at least once or twice during the movie, for the most part fits very well. It mixes horror and action type scoring here. So there are uses of minimal orchestra here. Most of the music is for suspense, though a couple of times, like the train battle, it swells up and adds a whole nother level of intensity and epicness to the scene, especially the use of strings and some brass and woodwind here and there. Of course, now we come to the big thing, which is the script, and as I've hinted at before, it's not exactly much. Now, I don't like to actively compare a book to a film because they're completely separate mediums, but I feel that here this is important to really understand the film. The film, despite being written by the same man, feels very different to the book. What's funny about it is that most of the book actually, while not necessarily being great literature, felt very appropriate for a film. There were a number of times where I was like, you know what, that would look great on screen. And it felt sort of film scriptish in the way some of it was written. So I assumed that it would just be a straight up conversion. But no, it seems that Graham Smith, for whatever reason, rewrote a lot of the material and changed a lot of the structure. The thing about the book is that despite the title, it is mostly a biography of Lincoln. It's played very straight. It's just that obviously they skew it with the vampire thing. I mean, Henry's still in it, the vampire training is still in it, but it's different. The major things about the book to film transition is that the film has about a third of the characters in the book, and some are changed. For instance, one of Abe's friends in the book is a muscly white guy, sort of like the 19th century equivalent of a jock. And in the film, he's a black man who was a friend of Lincoln back in his childhood. And there are a couple of other little things like the opening being different, how Abe's mother dies being different, how he trains being different, which was one of the big differences because in the book he actually takes it upon himself and he meets Henry later, who shows him what really can kill a vampire versus all the old myths, whereas in the film Henry just teaches him everything outright. And the book doesn't have as many fight sequences as in the movie, especially the train battle. That was probably one of the big changes. But even deeper than just those cosmetic things is a change of themes. While the book may not be the deepest thing ever written, it used the whole vampire thing as a sort of commentary on the ideology of the time, especially relating to slavery and the recurring line, "Judge us not equally, Abraham." And the whole issue with vampires really set up why Abraham went ahead and did things like the Emancipation Proclamation. There are elements of that, but it's not as dominant as it was in the book. Here it's watered down and more in the background. And that's the best way to describe the whole film. The main plot is a bit watered down, or I should say, trimmed down. Seth Graham Smith, as I mentioned before, wrote this and the book, and of course he was the writer of Dark Shadows. And what's interesting is that a lot of people said that Dark Shadows overcomplicated its story. Here, he seems to have gone into reverse and oversimplified the story. There are a lot of little themes and notes from the book that were pretty much ready to be transitioned to the screen without much effort, and they're just not here. Graham has really pushed the envelope when it comes to the action stuff. He's really upped the ante on that front. That and the addition of a outright villain. In the movie, it was a agglomeration or order of vampires headed up by Adam, whereas in the book, it was just miscellaneous vampires who had grouped together and conspired with southern politicians. And there are some other details, but I'm not going to spoil them for the sake of the film, so let's just get to the real meat here. Even with all these changes, do I think that Vampire Hunter is worth a look? To which my answer is yes. The thing about this movie is you cannot go into something like this expecting great storytelling. At that same time, however, despite the title, you cannot go into this expecting just a glorified B-movie with more money. You cannot go into this expecting something like Van Helsing, which is something that I think a lot of people thought back to when they thought of this title as, oh, it's just going to be lots of supernatural things fighting each other, kind of like Van Helsing. Tonally, that sort of cheese factor would have been all wrong. The thing about the novel and the film, the one thing that they really do share in common, is that they're surprisingly straightforward and upfront. They don't ever descend into comedy or self-parody. There's none of that cheesy one-line business. There's no real sidekicks, even though one of Lincoln's friends is black, he's not here as like the Eddie Murphy style sidekick. He's played straight and he does get to kick some vampire ass on his own. and he is a surprisingly likable character. However, most of the characters here are a bit on the underdeveloped side, which again comes from Graham Smith choosing to really skim down the story. And there were a couple of times where the vampire lore was contradicted directly, where suddenly a character would do something and I just sat there going, wait, in an earlier scene didn't you say that you can't do this? But you know what? Those moments only occurred intermittently, but on the whole, the film I felt succeeded. The thing is, this film takes an approach not that dissimilar to movies like Shadow and Phantom, and even to a small extent films like League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. It focuses on its strengths and minimizes its weaknesses. It makes up for the fact that the story doesn't have much going for it by upping the ante on the action and by moving the film at a good pace. The film is very well paced, it's well edited. There's a good amount of action here which gets you from plot point to plot point without you overthinking on it. And even though the characters are underwritten, the actors do have charisma and they do give their roles what they can, which is a good deal bit more humanity than you would think. And certainly I have to praise Timur Bekimov for really taking this approach, for saying, you know what, Graham Smith hasn't offered me a great script, so let's focus on what we can work with. Let's make sure these actors are into their roles, let's make sure that the visuals are up to par, and let's give the audience some good, bloody action. And so, in conclusion, I must give Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter a bronze star. In fact, it's practically the definition of a good bronze star movie. It may not have much depth or brilliance, but when a premise like this comes around, you really don't need it. It has more than enough blood and action in here, and it moves at a good enough pace so that you're never really bothered by the problems here. And certainly when this does come out on home media, it's the perfect movie to watch on a Friday over a pizza.